He was never supposed to survive the harbor fire. Not the handlers. Not the dog. And certainly not the truth buried beneath the freezing waters of Black Harbour. But during the worst Atlantic storm Nova Scotia had seen that winter, something came crawling back out of the dark. The snow came sideways across the harbor after midnight, sharp as salt against skin. Cargo cranes groaned above the waterfront while old fishing boats strained against frozen ropes beneath the wind. Near Warehouse 14, a harbor worker named Lionel Beecham found blood in the snow beside the chain-link perimeter fence. 20 feet farther, half buried beneath drifting ice, lay a wounded German shepherd barely breathing beside the loading dock. One security guard assigned to the harbor patrol was missing. RCMP units arrived 12 minutes later. Sergeant Ethan Mercer stepped out of his cruiser into the freezing wind with snow collecting across the shoulders of his winter jacket. At 41, Ethan carried the quiet exhaustion of a man who trusted silence more than conversation. He had spent years working alongside RCMP K-9 units before transferring into investigations after a partner died during a northern operation outside Fort McMurray. He never talked about it anymore. Detective Malcolm Reed already stood near the perimeter speaking calmly with officers beneath flashing emergency lights. Tall. Silver-haired. Respected across the province. The kind of senior detective younger officers trusted without question. Dogs still alive, one constable told Ethan while paramedics loaded the shepherd into an emergency transport van. Barely. Ethan climbed inside beside the animal as freezing rain rattled against the roof overhead. The shepherd never opened its eyes during the drive into town. The veterinary clinic on Main Street smelled of antiseptic, wet wool, and burnt coffee left too long on a warmer. Claire McKenna, the overnight veterinary technician, wrapped heated blankets around the dog while monitors beeped softly beside the treatment table. No tags. No microchip, she said quietly. But these injuries are old. Somebody trained him. Ethan crouched beside the table. Even unconscious, the shepherd rested angled toward the entrance instead of curling inward like a frightened stray. Guard position. Instinct. Ethan recognized it immediately. Without thinking, he used an old RCMP K-9 command while checking reflexes. Watch. The shepherd's amber eyes snapped open instantly. Claire froze. Oh my God. Before Ethan could answer, the clinic door opened behind them. Cold wind swept through the room as Malcolm Reed entered removing snow from his coat sleeves. Any update from the harbor? He asked. The moment the shepherd saw him, its breathing changed. Ears lifted. Muscles tightened beneath the blankets. A low growl rolled through the room. Not fear. Recognition. Ethan slowly turned toward Malcolm while the dog's eyes remained locked on the detective. Malcolm recovered quickly, forcing a tired smile. Looks like he does not care for strangers. Ethan noticed it anyway. The tiny hesitation behind Malcolm's calm expression. Small. Hidden. But real. Outside, the Atlantic storm howled across Black Harbour while somewhere deep inside the clinic, the old shepherd refused to look away from the men standing near the door. By sunrise the harbor sat beneath a sheet of freezing fog drifting inland from the Atlantic. Ethan Mercer had not slept. He sat alone in the RCMP records office scrolling through archived files tied to Warehouse 14 while stale coffee cooled beside the keyboard. Most reports connected to the old harbor fire from 8 years earlier had been partially sealed. 4 handlers dead. 3 K-9 units presumed lost. Investigation closed within 11 days. Too fast for a federal operation involving military cargo. Whole witness statements were missing from the archive. Evidence logs ended abruptly. Ethan printed copies quietly and slid them into a manila folder before anyone noticed. Claire called just after 9 in the morning. You need to see this, she whispered. Back at the clinic, the shepherd rested beneath clean bandages while winter light spilled weakly through the frosted windows. Claire carefully lifted the dog's rear leg revealing faded tattoo markings hidden beneath the fur. Government identification numbers. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. RCMP. Claire asked softly. Maybe military support. The shepherd watched Ethan closely while he examined the scars across its shoulders. Surgical precision. Reinforced muscle damage. Training injuries. This had once been a working K-9. Malcolm Reed arrived just after noon carrying coffee from the diner across the street. Calm as ever. Friendly. Controlled. "You look terrible," he told Ethan lightly. "You have been digging through old ghosts all night." Ethan held his gaze. "Warehouse 14 burned pretty fast for an accident." Malcolm gave a faint smile. "Sometimes people move quickly when federal agencies get involved." The shepherd growled low from the treatment table. Malcolm glanced toward the dog briefly before returning his attention to Ethan. "You know what your problem is?" he asked quietly. "You always needed answers for everything." Ethan noticed something underneath the older detective's voice now. "Not fear exactly. Calculation." Malcolm stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Listen carefully. That fire destroyed families around this town. Reopening it will not help anybody." "Maybe not," Ethan replied. "But burying it helped someone." Silence settled between them while snow tapped softly against the clinic windows. Malcolm's jaw tightened almost invisibly. Then he forced another calm smile. "You still think the world works clean? Good men. Bad men. Real life does not." Before leaving, Malcolm stopped beside the treatment table 1 second too long. The shepherd stared at him without blinking. Ethan caught the look that passed across Malcolm's face before he turned away. Recognition. And underneath it, something colder. That night Ethan quietly uploaded copies of the archived files and evidence photos onto a secure RCMP cloud server using an inactive case contact from Internal Affairs in Halifax. If anything happened to him, the files would automatically forward by morning. He did not trust the system fully anymore. But he trusted Malcolm even less. Snow began falling heavily again after dark. The storm lights along Main Street glowed pale through drifting fog while harbor bells echoed somewhere beyond the waterfront. Inside the veterinary clinic, the shepherd rested near the treatment room under dim emergency lamps while Claire prepared fresh medication trays. Ethan sat nearby reviewing printed evidence when the front bell chimed softly. Malcolm Reed stepped inside brushing snow from his shoulders. "Power outages all over town," he said calmly. "Thought I would check on you too." The shepherd lifted its head immediately. Watching him. Malcolm leaned casually against the counter. "You know, Ethan, there are people connected to that old fire who are still very powerful." Ethan remained silent. Malcolm studied him carefully. "I kept thinking you would let this go." There it was. The first honest sentence Malcolm had spoken. "Why?" Ethan asked quietly. "Because suspicion I could manage," Malcolm replied softly. "Proof is harder." The room fell silent except for wind rattling against the clinic windows. Then suddenly the lights went out. Darkness swallowed the building. Claire cursed softly from the hallway while emergency backup lights flickered red across the walls. The shepherd rose instantly despite injured ribs. A metal clang echoed somewhere behind the clinic. Ethan grabbed his flashlight. "Stay here," he told Claire. The rear service corridor smelled of bleach and freezing Atlantic air pouring through an open back door. Snow blew across the tile floor beneath flashing emergency lights. Fresh bootprints led toward the alley behind the building. Someone had cut the kennel locks. The shepherd growled toward the darkness outside while Ethan followed the tracks into the storm. No vehicle remained nearby. Whoever entered the clinic had left seconds earlier. Malcolm appeared behind Ethan beneath the rear doorway. "Could have been teenagers," he offered. Ethan looked back coldly. "Teenagers cutting kennel locks during a blizzard?" Malcolm did not answer immediately. Snow collected across his silver hair while wind howled between the buildings. "Move the dog somewhere safer," he finally said quietly. "If this reaches the wrong people, you will both end up buried beside that warehouse." Ethan stared at him. "Who says I am alone in this anymore?" Malcolm's expression shifted slightly. Ethan tapped the folder beneath his coat. "Files are already uploaded." For the first time, genuine worry flickered behind Malcolm's eyes. Small. Controlled. But impossible to hide completely. The shepherd continued staring at him through the blowing snow while somewhere farther down the alley, a church bell echoed midnight across Black Harbour. An hour later Ethan drove north along the coastal highway through freezing rain with the shepherd asleep across the back seat beneath heavy wool blankets Claire packed before they left town. The old RCMP truck rattled against icy roads carved between dark pine forests and rocky Atlantic cliffs. Ethan's late father's fishing cabin sat nearly 40 kilometers outside Black Harbour overlooking Mahone Bay. Few people even remembered the place existed anymore. The cabin smelled of cedar smoke, sea salt, and old timber warped by decades of winter storms. Ethan lit the wood stove while the shepherd settled near the fire, still watching every doorway out of habit. Claire arrived shortly before dawn carrying antibiotics and fresh bandages. Snow clung to her parka while wind pushed cold air through the doorway. "You think Malcolm sent someone to the clinic?" she asked quietly. Ethan stared toward the fire. "I think Malcolm is scared." The shepherd lifted his head at the sound of the detective's name. Ethan spread harbor maps and old files across the kitchen table beneath weak morning light filtering through frosted windows. One detail finally stopped him cold. Malcolm Reed's name appeared repeatedly in shipping authorization records months before the fire itself. Not as investigator afterward. As supervisor during military freight clearance operations tied directly to Warehouse 14. Ethan leaned back slowly. He was there before everything burned. Claire studied the paperwork silently. Weapons. Or something close enough people were willing to kill for. Later that afternoon the shepherd suddenly became restless near the shoreline behind the cabin. Ethan followed him through drifting snow down toward an abandoned fishing dock half buried beneath ice. The dog pawed weakly at frozen sand until Ethan uncovered a burned military dog tag weathered by salt water. Sergeant Daniel Vickers. K-9 Unit. Nearby lay several old shell casings hidden beneath years of snow and debris. Ethan stared toward the crashing Atlantic beyond the rocks while cold wind moved through the pine trees around them. The official report claimed the handlers died during an accidental warehouse explosion. But shell casings meant gunfire before the fire. The shepherd lowered his nose gently against the burned dog tag. Not aggression. Mourning. Ethan understood then with terrible clarity. Daniel Vickers and his team never died in an accident. They were silenced. The next morning freezing fog covered Mahone Bay while Ethan sat alone at the kitchen table recording a full statement into his encrypted RCMP case file. Names. Dates. Shipping manifests. Malcolm Reed's authorization records. He uploaded everything directly through the secure internal affairs server in Halifax. Automatic release scheduled every 6 hours unless manually cancelled with his credentials. Claire watched quietly from beside the stove. "Now if something happens to you," she said softly, "the files still go through." Ethan nodded once. "That is the idea." The shepherd rested nearby with one ear twitching toward every sound outside the cabin. He had begun following Ethan from room to room now, never more than a few feet away. Small rituals formed quietly between them over the next day. Ethan leaving a second coffee mug beside the stove out of habit. The shepherd sleeping directly beside the front door each night. Ethan brushing snow carefully from the dog's back after short walks along the frozen shoreline. Neither trusted silence anymore. Near dusk Ethan's phone rang from an unknown number. Malcolm Reed's voice emerged through static and wind. "You still have time to walk away." Ethan stepped onto the porch beneath falling snow. "You murdered RCMP officers." Long silence followed. Then Malcolm spoke again, quieter now. "You think this starts and ends with me?" Ethan said nothing. "Those shipments touched Ottawa contracts, military brokers, border agencies," Malcolm continued. "I spent years keeping that fire contained. By killing your own people." Malcolm exhaled slowly through the line. Daniel Vickers would not stand down. None of them would. The confession hung between them like smoke in cold air. "You could have let the dog disappear quietly," Malcolm murmured. "Instead you turned him back into a witness." The line disconnected. Minutes later headlights appeared through the storm below the cabin road. A black pickup accelerated suddenly toward Ethan's parked RCMP cruiser. Metal screamed across ice as the truck slammed the vehicle sideways toward the ditch. Ethan barely avoided the impact while the shepherd lunged from the porch barking violently into the storm. The pickup disappeared into the snow without stopping. Ethan steadied himself against the frozen guardrail, breathing hard. The shepherd pressed against his side despite shaking ribs. Ethan rested one hand against the dog's neck while watching the empty road vanish into darkness. Malcolm was done pretending now. An hour later, Ethan contacted Internal Affairs directly through encrypted dispatch and transmitted his live GPS location. "If I do not check in within 90 minutes, he told the Halifax investigator quietly, "send tactical units to Warehouse 14. Claire looked at him across the cabin. "You already know he will be there." Ethan glanced toward the shepherd. The old dog stood waiting beside the door as though hearing some distant command carried through the Atlantic wind. "So does he." The harbor looked abandoned beneath the storm when Ethan finally returned to Black Harbour shortly after midnight. Freezing rain swept sideways across the loading yards while old floodlights flickered weakly through the fog drifting in from the Atlantic. Cargo containers stood buried in ice and shadow beneath the crashing sound of waves beyond the seawall. Warehouse 14 waited at the edge of the harbor like something forgotten by time itself. One loading door hung partially open. The shepherd stopped immediately beside Ethan. Low growl. Focused. Ethan rested one hand near his holstered service weapon and entered the warehouse. Saltwater and old smoke lingered beneath the dripping steel rafters. Rainwater fell steadily through holes in the roof while loose chains moved softly in the wind. Then a voice echoed from the upper catwalk. I wondered how long it would take. Malcolm Reed stepped into view. Beneath a weak emergency light, revolver resting loosely in one hand. Snow melted slowly through his silver hair while exhaustion hollowed his face beneath the flashing storm outside. The shepherd moved directly in front of Ethan without hesitation. Malcolm stared down at the dog for several long seconds. Still looking at me the same way, he whispered. Ethan held his gaze. You knew he survived? Malcolm descended the metal stairs slowly. No. I hoped he did not. The shepherd growled deeper. Malcolm stopped halfway down the stairs. You uploaded the files. Enough to bury this case permanently. Malcolm gave a tired laugh without humor. You really think they will thank you for this? Ethan stepped closer. Daniel Vickers trusted you. Something inside Malcolm cracked visibly at the handler's name. Daniel forced my hand. You ordered the cleanup. Malcolm's breathing changed. Less controlled now. Those containers carried military shipments tied to people far above me. If that operation leaked publicly, careers would have burned across the country. So you burned the handlers instead. Malcolm snapped suddenly. I kept this harbor alive. His voice thundered through the warehouse before falling back into strained silence. Rain hammered against the steel roof overhead. The shepherd never looked away from him. Malcolm noticed. Fear finally surfaced openly beneath his anger. I watched that dog disappear in flames, he whispered. It should have ended here. Ethan slowly raised his phone showing the live recording screen. Internal Affairs already has everything. Malcolm froze. Then rage flooded across his face completely. Jesus Christ, Ethan, he hissed. You just could not leave it alone. He raised the revolver suddenly. The shot exploded through the warehouse as Ethan dove behind stacked pallets. The shepherd lunged instantly into the darkness while metal crashed overhead. Malcolm stumbled backward against the catwalk railing as the dog slammed into him hard enough to send the revolver skidding across wet concrete below. Ethan fired one warning shot upward while racing toward the fallen weapon. Malcolm struck the shepherd away and lunged for the revolver at the same moment Ethan reached him. Both men crashed heavily across the flooded floor beneath falling chains and broken wood. Malcolm fought wildly now. No calm left. No control. Only panic buried beneath years of guilt. You should have stayed buried with them, he shouted. The shepherd dragged himself forward despite exhaustion and planted his body between Malcolm and Ethan. Once more. Then distant sirens echoed through the harbor outside. Malcolm heard them too. Tactical units. Internal Affairs had tracked Ethan's emergency locator directly to Warehouse 14. Red and blue lights burst through the loading doors moments later while RCMP officers flooded the building shouting commands. Malcolm stopped fighting at last. Handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists beneath flashing emergency lights and freezing rain. Ethan collapsed beside the shepherd, breathing hard while the old dog lowered his head quietly against Ethan's chest as though finally understanding the fire was over. Morning arrived slowly over Black Harbour beneath clear winter skies washed pale gold by sunrise. Fresh snow covered the harbor roads and fishing docks while gulls circled above the Atlantic carried by cold coastal wind. The storm was gone at last. Ethan Mercer sat alone in the veterinary clinic waiting room with a cooling paper cup between his hands while sunlight spilled softly through the windows onto the tiled floor. Across town, internal affairs officers continued removing old evidence boxes from storage lockers and sealed archives. Names buried for 8 years finally returned to official records. Sergeant Daniel Vickers. Constable Renee Coulter. Officer Mark Gervais. Not victims of an accident anymore. Officers betrayed by corruption and silence. Inside the treatment room, Brigadier rested beneath fresh blankets while Claire adjusted clean bandages around the healing shoulder wound reopened during the warehouse struggle. The old shepherd looked tired now. Older somehow. But peaceful for the first time since Ethan found him beside the loading docks. Claire stepped quietly into the waiting room holding a weathered identification card recovered from reopened evidence files. "You should probably keep this," she said softly. Ethan studied the faded photograph beneath the cracked plastic cover. Daniel Vickers knelt beside a younger German shepherd years earlier beneath summer sunlight near the harbor training yard. Beneath the image remained one line untouched by smoke and seawater. K9 name, Brigadier. Ethan looked through the treatment room window toward the old dog resting under warm clinic lights. "That was his name," Claire said quietly. Ethan nodded once. "Still is." Later that afternoon Ethan opened the clinic door as sunlight reflected brightly across fresh snow lining Main Street. Church bells echoed softly across Black Harbour while fishing crews returned slowly to the docks beneath clear Atlantic skies. Brigadier stepped carefully outside beside him, one paw slightly stiff but steady. For a moment. The old shepherd paused facing the distant harbor where Warehouse 14 stood silent near the frozen waterfront. Ethan waited beside him without speaking. Wind moved gently through Brigadier's fur carrying the scent of salt water and pine through town. Then slowly, after a lifetime spent looking back toward fire and ghosts, the old shepherd turned away from the harbor and walked forward beside Ethan into the winter sunlight while fresh Canadian snow crunched softly beneath their feet and somewhere far behind them, the last buried secret of Black Harbour finally stopped hiding.